Wendy is the author of a book called Great Unrecorded History, A New Life of E.M. Forster, from Farrar, Straus and Giroux, released in the spring of 2010. Now, Wendy is an associate professor of English at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And while this is her first book, it has been named one of the top 10 books of 2010 by the New York Times. It also received the 2010 prize for Best First Biography from the UK's Biographers Club. Well, Wendy, welcome to the show and congratulations for all of the accolades.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, that has to be pretty exciting, being your first book, and yet all of this happens to you, and we're going to talk about that a little further on. But first of all, for those of the listeners that don't know, who was E.M. Forster?
E.M. Forster was a British writer, a novelist, who was born in the Victorian period and died in 1970. He's probably most known for a series of comic novels that were made into wonderful merchant ivory films in the 1980s, A Room with a View and Where Angels Fear to Tread. And he's wonderful comic sort of novels of social manners at the turn of the 20th century.
Uh-huh.
He also wrote A Passage to India, which was the last book that he published as a novel, and is a very important book about post-colonialism. Mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful novelist.
Yes. Well, what I want to ask next is, what is new and different about this biography than others about him?
Well, what's new and different is that I really found a huge unpublished archive of his private writings, which he preserved. Forster was gay, and at the time that he was living, until really very close to the end of his death, it was not only illegal to be gay, but also very shameful to his family.
When did he die? Let me interject.
He died in 1970, so he's 16 when Oscar Wilde goes to prison, and he dies the year after the Stonewall riots, which is quite a change in attitudes towards homosexuality.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing.
So I found this archive, and it's quite extraordinary, and it sort of puts together a private view of him that he was preserving to integrate with the public view. So there's a lot of new stories about who he is and about what life was like for gay men during that period of time.
Where did you find this material, Wendy?
I began at King's College in Cambridge, which is where he went to undergraduate school and where he was a fellow late in his life. And a lot of it was there. It's all in manuscript form, and his writing is very hard to read. So I think other people might have been daunted by that. But I followed the threads literally all over the world, interviewing many, many of his surviving friends and finding out about gay cultures in Alexandria, in Egypt, in New York, in Greenwich Village around the Second World War, in England, all over the place.
Now, when you say it was hard to read, are you referring to the content of the material?
No,
or
just
his handwriting?
My daughter said, "Mom, his handwriting is worse than yours," which says something.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because, yes, writings from a certain period were tough to read. I've experienced that myself. What's the relationship between Forster's public and private life and his writing?
I think it's very important to know how he really tried to live an ethical life as a gay man without being overtly out about it. He was really interested in being compassionate towards other people. I think his view of society came from being an outsider. It made him sympathetic to women's views, and he wrote Howard's End, which is a wonderful novel written from the point of view of a young woman. Actually, many of his novels are from the point of view of young women. He was really interested in power relations and how they could be abused. So he was very sympathetic to Indians in A Passage to India and very critical of the English. I think when you see his struggles in his private life, you understand him better as a liberal person who is trying to live ethically.
Well, do you think that's the standard response that's being given to his writings? Pardon me, I've had a little coughing spell here.
Well, no, I don't really think so. I think that Forster was understood sort of almost as an Edwardian writer, somebody who was looking backwards into the past. We sort of, especially from those wonderful Merchant Ivory films, I think we think of, white dresses and playing tennis on the lawn and that sort of thing. Whereas he's really very gritty in his realism about the difficulties of the world. He's very alert, for example. He has a series of wonderful essays in the 30s as the Second World War is coming on about anti-Semitism, about how dangerous it is to think that you could be more secure as a country if you became less interested in civil liberties. He was talking to English people, but it seems pertinent to American people today as well.
Why did you choose him, of all people, to write about?
Well, I wrote my dissertation at Yale on him and Woolf and Conrad a long time ago. I've always loved that period of the experimental modern novel. But I really fell in love with his interior life when I began to read these papers. It took me 10 years to do this work.
Well, now, had you found those papers when you were doing your dissertation, or did you know about it and this came later? How did that come together?
This came later. I wrote about his novels. I was doing sort of standard literary criticism, and then when I went to teach in England for a year at the University of East Anglia, I went to see the archives because I was just interested and curious. I thought I was going to write a book about these wonderful political essays, but it just sucked me in that it was such a fascinating story of how difficult it was for him to keep his private life private and to sort of make these communities of gay men. He was always interested in a kind of utopian idea that gay men could have families and be in love in the same way that straight people could. It's something that we take for granted now, but was really quite revolutionary at the time, and also very looked down on by some of his gay friends who said, "That's not really. We don't really want to act like that. We're not really into commitment." He really was.
Do Americans read his work differently from British people? For instance, I've read in one of the material that I received about the book that his mother's friends couldn't really figure out the genre of these early novels of manners, Room with a View and Where Angels Fear to Tread. And they wanted to know, is this a comedy, a tragedy?
Right.
And so that also related to the question, how does and doesn't it reflect British society at the time it was written? Why the confusion?
It's a great question. I think we associate modern novelists like Woolf with being highly experimental, very inward and strange kind of fiction, almost like Picasso might be a brand new kind of painting at that time. And Forster looks more conservative. But I think he's very honest and mixed in his humor. And he was very much a social critic from within English society, and I think that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. For Americans, I think they're more comfortable looking at this and saying, they see that these things are funny in a way. They recognize that in a way it's, I think, easier to laugh at another kind of cultural parody than your own. And so I think for Americans, his work is more broadly comic. I think there's a bit more sting if it's a British look at things.
Mm-hmm. I've read some of the book reviews of the book by both British and American book critics, and it's kind of a mixed bag, although most of them certainly do agree with the book itself and your writing and so forth. There seems to be some difference in the reaction to all of the well, for want of a better word, sex details that are included, what he did. And I certainly won't repeat it on air. Anybody, I'm sure, listening can get the book and read it. So has there been a difference that way in response to the sexual material from the British, between the British and the American readers and book critics? Not so much in terms of culture. There is, I think,
I think there are people for whom the idea of a sexual biography sounds salacious. It sounds as though I'm talking about sex for the sake of talking about sex. One of the things that's interesting to me is that Forster's sexuality was absolutely central to his being. That's why he preserved this huge archive. And he writes about it over and over again, and he writes gay fiction that he doesn't publish until after his death. So for him, this is a redress of a kind of distortion of the way that we understood gay people. He says it's not that society hates homosexuals, it's that they hate having to think about it. And so I think in some ways some of the response to my book has been not so much a response to me as a response to Forster demanding a certain kind of honesty in his private writing.
Yeah. That's a great point.
It's an interesting thing, and I wrestled with it a bit because you don't want to lay out people's dirty linen. It's not an expose kind of a biography. In fact, I think it's a sexual biography because for him it was a real struggle to be who he really was and not a liar in some ways if he was going to be a gay man. He never married, he never pretended he wasn't gay, he never sort of played the game, and that took a lot of effort and energy.
Well, and obviously, if he left all of those writings, he wanted them to be published someday.
No question.
Yeah,
no question. He burned huge piles of materials when he moved from a large house to rooms at King's in 1947. And he had 30 more years, and during those 30 more years, he sat around and organized this archive, annotated it, and went back over it. He was very alert to the idea that there might come a time after his death when people would respect homosexual love as being a kind of human love on a par with straight people's love. And that was important to him. He wasn't asking for any special pleadings. He was saying, this is one way of being a human being.
Now, I'd like to ask you about winning the awards, if you can keep it brief also. How has winning these awards affected your work as a professor or writer, and just your response to it as a person?
Well, when I was writing this, I knew it was an exciting story to me, and I really believed and hoped that there would be an audience for it. I was really bowled over by how good the response was and how kind. I've gotten hundreds of letters from people who said that this book touched them in some way, gay and straight readers both. And it's just really been a wonderful sort of Forsterian thing to connect up in that way with an audience who's interested in these ideas and this man. So that was really great.
Do you think that he's being rediscovered by younger readers? Obviously, you teach. Are you exposing your students to his work?
I hope so. I think he's really, really pertinent to today's world. I know that sounds kind of funny to talk about a writer who was writing 100 years ago, but his alertness to the ways that the world is more complicated than we think it is at first when we're being conventional is a really good guide for young people in sort of not just jumping to a conclusion. My students love Forster. When they read him, and they haven't read him before college usually, they are really struck. The young men in particular, are struck by the idea that a man could have a really thoughtful, interesting, emotional life and have to work things out for himself.
Well, Wendy, I think that's a good note on which to end. We are already out of time. It goes so quickly when we're enjoying ourselves. I want to wish you luck, and thank you so much,
Jacqueline.
for being here.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
It's a pleasure.